The city shimmered under the soft veil of twilight, lights flickering on in a slow cascade across buildings that towered like glass titans. The streets pulsed with life, taxis honking, people weaving through crosswalks, and laughter spilling from crowded cafes. To the untrained eye, it was a city teeming with endless possibilities, but for Mara Thompson, it was a place of constant pressure, a relentless reminder of how hard she'd fought to carve out a space for herself. At 32, Mara had the sharp edges of someone who had worked her way up from nothing. Her dark hair was always pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, though bright, carried a guarded intelligence. As a marketing strategist at one of the city's top firms, her days were filled with pitches, data analyses, and the constant push to stay ahead of the curve. Success hadn't come easily, and Mara wore her accomplishments like armor. But the quiet moments between the chaos felt hollow. Her sleek, modern apartment downtown held no warmth. The walls, adorned with minimalist art, felt sterile. The silence at night pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She had a thriving career, a small circle of trusted friends, and a home she owned outright. Achievements she was proud of. And yet, a whisper of loneliness lingered, a question she couldn't quite answer. Is this all there is? She sighed, sipping her coffee as she gazed out her apartment window. The world continued its restless dance below, but Mara felt detached from it. She longed for something more, though she couldn't put a name to it. Connection, maybe, a sense that her life wasn't just a series of checkmarks on a list of achievements. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her reverie. A text popped up from her best friend. Elise, don't forget, drinks tonight at the Lantern. No excuses. You need this. Mara's lips quirked into a small smile. Elise was right. She did need this. A break from the spreadsheets and strategy meetings, a chance to lose herself in conversation, to laugh and let her guard down. She texted back, "I'll be there." The Lantern was a cozy bar tucked between a row of brownstones, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk like an invitation. The scent of aged whiskey and citrus mingled with the hum of conversation. Mara stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft thud, shutting out the noise of the city. Elise waved her over to a booth near the back. "Finally," she teased. "I thought you were going to bail." Mara smirked. "Wouldn't give you the satisfaction." They laughed, the sound genuine and easy. Elise launched into a story about a disastrous date, and Mara let the tension in her shoulders melt away. She sipped her drink, the warmth spreading through her, reminding her that there was life beyond work. Her attention was drawn to a burst of laughter from the bar. A man stood there, leaning against the counter, talking animatedly with the bartender. He was dressed in worn jeans and a simple navy sweater, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. His eyes crinkled with mirth, and his smile was wide and unguarded. Something about him caught her off guard. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably handsome. It was his ease. He seemed completely at home in his skin, unfazed by the world around him. There was an authenticity in his laughter that felt rare. Elise followed her gaze and grinned. "You're staring." Mara's cheeks warmed. "I am not. Go talk to him." "Absolutely not." But as if sensing the conversation, the man looked over and met Mara's eyes. His smile softened, and a spark of curiosity flickered across his face. He said something to the bartender, then picked up his drink and walked over to their booth. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and smooth. "I'm Nate." Elise shot Mara a look and slid out of the booth. "I'm Elise, and I was just leaving you two to talk." Mara glared at her friend, who winked and disappeared into the crowd. She turned back to Nate, who was watching her with an amused expression. "Sorry about that," Mara said, trying to suppress a smile. "I'm Mara." "Nice to meet you, Mara." He nodded toward the empty seat. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated for only a moment before gesturing for him to sit. "Sure." Nate settled into the seat, his presence easygoing. "So, do you always stare at strangers? Or am I just special?" Mara laughed, the sound surprising even her. "You were loud. Hard to miss." I'll take that as a compliment, he said, his eyes glinting. So, what do you do when you're not observing unsuspecting bar patrons? She leaned back, the familiar walls around her slipping just a little. I work in marketing. And you? He took a sip of his drink, his gaze thoughtful. I work in investments. But mostly, I just try to enjoy life. There was something in his tone, a hint of self-awareness, of irony, that intrigued her. He didn't seem like the type to be chasing wealth and status, not with his worn clothes and easy humor. They fell into a rhythm of conversation that felt effortless. He listened intently, his questions thoughtful, his laughter genuine. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Finally, as the bar began to thin out, Nate glanced at his watch. It was an unassuming piece, simple and classic. Mara barely registered it, her focus on his eyes, which held a quiet intensity. I should probably get going, he said reluctantly. But I'd love to see you again. She hesitated, the old walls threatening to rise. But something about him made her want to take a chance. Me too, she said softly. They exchanged numbers, and as he walked away, she felt a strange flutter of anticipation. It had been a long time since she'd felt anything close to this. That night, as she lay in bed, Mara replayed their conversation. His laughter, the way his eyes seemed to see past the facade she usually wore. She didn't know much about him, but something told her there was more to Nate than he let on. What she didn't know was that this simple encounter would unravel secrets and connections she couldn't yet fathom, and that their paths, seemingly so different, were woven together by threads of fate, loss, and a chance at redemption neither of them knew they needed. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. Nate and Mara slipped into an easy rhythm, their conversations stretching late into the night. Coffee dates turned into long walks through the city, where they wandered aimlessly, losing track of time. The more she got to know him, the more Mara felt the guarded walls around her heart begin to crumble. His humor, his down-to-earth simplicity, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts made her feel seen in a way she hadn't for years. One crisp autumn evening, they sat in a small park nestled between rows of brownstones. The trees shed golden leaves that swirled around their feet. Nate leaned back on the bench, his gaze fixed on the skyline glowing with evening light. You know, he said, breaking the comfortable silence, I really admire what you've built for yourself. Mara smiled faintly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Thanks, but sometimes it feels like all I've built is a fortress. He turned to her, his eyes gentle. Why a fortress? To keep from getting hurt, she admitted softly. When you work so hard for something, you want to protect it. Protect yourself. Nate nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get that. Sometimes protecting ourselves is the only thing we know how to do. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of this man who seemed so open yet carried an air of mystery. But she held back, afraid to disturb the delicate balance they'd found. A week later, Mara and Nate found themselves at a cozy Italian restaurant, their favorite spot. The check arrived, and before Mara could reach for it, Nate grabbed it, his eyes twinkling. My turn, he said with a grin. She rolled her eyes playfully. You don't always have to pay, you know. I can hold my own. I know, he said, his smile softening. That's one of the things I love about you. The word hung between them, unspoken until now. Love. Her heart skipped, warmth spreading through her chest. Before she could respond, he changed the subject with a joke, diffusing the moment. But the word lingered, a silent promise. As they left the restaurant, the evening air crisp around them, Mara took his hand. Felt natural, as if they had been walking together for years. But as they strolled toward the subway, something shifted. Nate's phone buzzed, and his hand tensed in hers. He glanced at the screen and frowned. I need to take this. I'll be right back. He stepped away, his voice low as he spoke. Mara watched his expression change. His jaw tightening, his brow furrowing. A side of him she hadn't seen before. When he returned, his smile was strained. Everything okay? She asked, concern threading her voice. Yeah, he said, forcing a smile. Just some work stuff. She didn't press, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. He had always been so transparent, so genuine. What could possibly trouble him this much? Over the next few days, Nate became more distracted. Their conversations were still warm, but there was a distance, a shadow behind his eyes. The connection they had built felt fragile, like a thread fraying under tension. One evening, Mara decided to confront it. They were in her apartment, a takeout container between them, the TV playing quietly in the background. Nate was pushing food around with his fork, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Nate," she said gently, "what's going on?" He looked up, his eyes clouded. "What do you mean? You've been distant. Is there something you're not telling me?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "There's something I should have told you earlier. Something about who I am." Her heart thudded painfully. "What is it?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to say the words aloud. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not who you think I am. I mean, I am, but there's more." Mara's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I have money. A lot of it. I own a tech company and I've made investments that, well, they've done well. Really well." She stared at him, the room tilting slightly. "How much money?" "About $250 million, he said, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. She blinked, her mind struggling to process. The man who wore simple clothes, who clipped coupons, who let her pay for dinner sometimes. He was wealthy beyond anything she had imagined. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it shouldn't matter," he said, pain flickering across his face. "I didn't want you to see that. I wanted you to see me. The guy who loves your intelligence, who admires your strength. I didn't want my money to change how you felt." Mara's emotions twisted into a knot of confusion and hurt. "But you lied to me by not telling me." "I didn't lie," he said, his voice pleading. "I just held it back. I wanted to keep things simple. For once in my life, I wanted something real." She stood, the walls of the fortress she'd built around herself snapping back into place. "I don't know what's real anymore." Nate's face crumpled. "Mara, please. I didn't mean to hurt you. I need some time to think," she said, her voice shaking. I need space." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I understand." As he left, the door closing softly behind him, Mara sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The connection she had trusted felt shattered. The simplicity she valued now tangled with questions and doubts. She had opened her heart, only to find herself lost in a maze of secrets. And now, she had to decide whether the truth was something she could forgive, or if it was a wall too high to climb. The days that followed were quiet and cold. Mara wandered through her routine like a ghost, the weight of her confusion pressing down on her. The world that once felt structured and predictable now felt like shifting sand beneath her feet. Her heart ached with the memory of Nate's eyes, pleading, sincere, but burdened by the truth he'd withheld. She replayed every moment with him, scrutinizing his laughter, his thoughtful gestures, his simple way of living. The revelation of his wealth didn't align with the man she knew, the man who seemed to treasure ordinary moments, who celebrated her successes more than his own. And yet, the lie of omission gnawed at her. Trust was the foundation she had built her fortress on, and now that foundation felt cracked. One evening, as rain tapped gently against her window, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Nate. "Nate, I know you need space, but there's something I want to show you. Please meet me tomorrow at the old bookshop on 5th Street. If you decide not to come, I'll understand." She stared at the message, her heart pounding. The old bookshop was a place they had stumbled upon during one of their long walks, a dusty haven of forgotten stories. It had felt like a secret world just for them. A tear slid down her cheek. Despite everything, part of her still longed to understand, to hear him out. She took a shaky breath and typed, "Mara, I'll be there." The next day, the sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching like a canopy above the city. The scent of rain lingered in the air as Mara walked to the bookshop, her hands buried in her coat pockets. Doubt whispered at the edges of her mind, but she pushed forward. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. The familiar scent of aged paper and wood greeted her, calming her frayed nerves. The shop was dimly lit, the shadows deepening the maze of shelves. She spotted Nate in the back, standing near a worn armchair. He turned when he heard the bell, his face filled with cautious hope. He looked just as he always had, simple, unassuming, but with a depth in his eyes that held unspoken words. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she replied, her voice uncertain. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "You said there was something you wanted to show me." He gestured to the chair. "Please sit. I promise this will make sense." Reluctantly, she sat down. Nate walked over to a nearby shelf and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "This is mine," he said. "It's a journal I've kept for years. It's where I write down the things that matter most to me." She hesitated, then opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Some entries were short, others long, but all of them were raw and honest. She read snippets. "Met a woman today, Mara. She has this quiet strength that I can't stop thinking about. She paid for dinner tonight. I let her because she insisted, and it made her smile. I never thought I'd meet someone who doesn't care about the surface of things. Told her I admire her intelligence. Truth is, I admire everything about her. But I'm scared to tell her who I really am. I don't want to lose this." Mara's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. The words on the page were filled with vulnerability, with the fear and hope he had carried alongside his secret. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you show me this before?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that, if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently. I wanted you to know me before you knew about the money. I've spent years surrounded by people who only care about what I have. You were different. You cared about who I was." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't care about your money, Nate. I care that you didn't trust me enough to tell me." He knelt in front of her, his eyes glistening. "I know, and I'm sorry. I was trying to protect something real, but I ended up hurting you. I don't want secrets between us anymore." She searched his face, seeing the sincerity, the regret, and the hope reflected there. The man she had fallen for was still the same, kind, thoughtful, down to earth. His wealth didn't define him, his choices did, and he had chosen to live simply, to value authenticity over luxury. She took a deep breath, the walls around her heart loosening. "I'm scared too," she whispered, "but maybe we can figure this out together." His eyes widened with relief. "You mean that?" She nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Yeah, I mean that." Nate let out a shaky breath, his own tears spilling over. He took her hands in his, holding them tightly. "I promise no more secrets. Just us, figuring it out one step at a time." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "That's all I need." They walked out of the bookshop hand in hand, the clouds above them beginning to break apart, letting slivers of sunlight through. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening with renewed life. Mara looked at Nate, a sense of peace settling over her. They had faced the storm of secrets and doubt, and come out the other side stronger. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together. Sometimes, redemption didn't come in grand gestures, but in small, honest moments of truth. And in those moments they had found each other, not perfect but real and willing to try. The world felt a little brighter, a little warmer, as they stepped forward into their new beginning.